Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me for this Pulse event today. I'm going to share some high-level takeaways from Phocuswright's upcoming annual report, The State of Travel Startups 2021, of which I'm a co-author, along with Chetan Kapoor, who is one of our analysts for Asia Pacific. Hope the info I'll be sharing provides some good context for the rest of the discussion today. And just as a quick background, Phocuswright has been tracking travel startups for well over a decade. And we now have 3,800 companies in our global database at this point. And for this year's annual report, we looked back a little over a decade and included companies in the analysis that were founded since 2010, which wound up being almost 3,100 startups. So these companies collectively have raised nearly $34 billion in funding between 2010 and the third quarter of this year. And just some quick notes on this number. We don't include acquisition dollar values in our analysis, so this is pure funding rounds. And also, as a rule, we like to exclude from our analyses some of the common mobility categories, such as ride sharing, taxi hailing, and bike and scooter sharing, since the majority of their business is much more relevant to the local communities rather than proper travel. And also, they've raised so much money that they really would skew the analysis if we were to include those companies, that this dollar amount of funding would go to well over $100 billion. So let's look at how funding has trended over the past decade or so. Since 2010, funding had been growing in significant double digits practically every year. And 2019 was by far the biggest year in history for travel startups in terms of dollars raised, jumping from 5.8 billion in 2018 to 7.5 billion in 2019. Now for 2020, the shock to the industry induced by the pandemic caused funding to fall by 56% to 3.2 billion. But considering that the industry was at a virtual standstill for most of the year, we were expecting worse. And it shows that investors had great confidence that travel would definitely rebound eventually. And they have been active while there have been some good deals as the market has been depressed. Now for 2021, the lighter blue bar on the chart, as travel has started opening up again, we've seen investors' confidence really return. And we actually had met 2020's level of funding by the first half of the year. And as of the third quarter of this year, we're at just about 5 billion. And this is pretty fantastic because we're already past 2017 levels of funding and may even catch or surpass 2018 by the end of the year. So really good news there. And just a few recent funding highlights include Flix Mobility, which operates FlixBus and FlixTrain. They had raised a huge $650 million Series G round this past June. Airline tech provider Flyer, which landed $150 million Series C in June. RV rental marketplace Outdoorsy raised a $90 million Series D in June. And Spotnana, a corporate travel tech startup that's coming out of stealth mode, announced a Series A raise of $34 million in September. Now, in terms of industry verticals receiving the most attention from entrepreneurs, accommodations account for 1 out of every 3 startups founded. Hotel and hostel sits at the top of the list with 580 companies focused on this category. And next we see the short-term rental category with 327 companies founded. Why is accommodation so far and away the most popular vertical for companies to be started in? Well, it's highly fragmented, so there are lots of problems to solve, and these are relatively big ticket purchases where there's a lot of money changing hands, and that means there are big margins and big commissions to be earned. So we see the largest number of entrepreneurs focusing on that vertical. The same can't necessarily be said for the rest, including the next most popular verticals, tours and activities and air. These are large verticals in terms of the market size, but generally speaking, it's simply harder to make money there. There just aren't the commissions or margins, for example, in air, and the basket size is so much smaller in tours and activities. Now, I would lump some of the smaller ones, destination content, itinerary, and inspiration together into a trip planning category. And if we were to do that it would contain 459 companies, which would make it the second largest vertical when you look at it that way. So there are still plenty of entrepreneurs trying to solve the perennial problems of helping people figure out where to go and what to do. Now, looking at the top 10 most funded travel startups, accommodation startups take 4 out of the top 10 spots. And 5 of the top companies are from Asia Pacific, 4 from North America, and only 1 from Europe. Now, the top company far and away is Oyo in the hotel and hostel vertical, with over $4 billion in their coffers at this point. And the most common vertical here is short-term rentals, of which there are 3 companies, including 2 Chinese Airbnb-like platforms, Tuja and Zhaozu, and Sonder, which will shortly be leaving startup land and will become a publicly traded company via SPAC. Now, speaking of SPACs, starting during the peak of the pandemic in 2020, when travel industry funding slowed and governments were issuing fiscal stimulus and bailout packages, travel industry investors widely started using special purpose acquisition companies, or SPACs, also known as blank check companies, to acquire startups, often at attractive valuations during the pandemic, and list these companies on the public markets. And there are 4 short-term rental SPACs in the market, plus a bunch of other companies across plenty of other verticals that have either gone public via SPAC already or will by early 2022. And speaking of exits, in terms of more traditional exits, despite lots of good deals to be had, acquirer confidence has not really completely returned yet. Since 2010, 239 travel startups have been acquired total, and acquisitions peaked along with funding in 2019 with 39 acquisitions. And then despite the pandemic, 2020 came in on par with 2017 at 29 acquisitions. And in 2021 so far, there have been 16, and some highlights in terms of acquisitions. Some of the highest disclosed acquisitions in recent years have been $660 million for on-location experiences by Endeavor in January 2020, $400 million for Hotel Tonight by Airbnb in March 2019, $300 million for Drivey by Getaround in April 2019. And then looking by operational status of all these companies, we looked at this by emerging startups, which we defined as those founded just since 2016, versus matured startups, which we defined as those founded between 2010 and 2015. So that's emerging in the blue, obviously, mature in the darker color. So a few things that jump out here. 736 of the 3,080 total travel startups in this analysis, or 24%, have closed their doors. And so mature startups have double the rate of closure relative to emerging startups. So despite having generally more capital and deeper investor inroads to sustain through financial impacts, this highlights how many companies presumably just ran out of time and or money and had to shut down after 5 years or so. And 12% of mature startups have been acquired. That would be 6% that are still operating, plus the 6% that close after being acquired on the darker bars towards the right of the chart, compared to 3% of emerging startups. That highlights how the road to acquisition often does take 5 to 10 years, if not longer. And what will be really interesting to see is how many companies may have gone out of business during the pandemic. And this is not something that we've historically tracked because it's pretty hard to figure out when any individual company might have closed. But this is something that we have started tracking now, and that data will be ready pretty soon. So that'll be something I'll be happy to share in a future presentation. But for those of us who are luckily still in business and still here, I hope you found this helpful, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the event.